Welcome to Inside American Politics, brought to you by Skoob. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into the life of a man who stood at the crossroads of power, scandal, and legacy. A figure born into America's royal family, yet haunted by ghosts both public and personal. This isn't just the story of a U.S. senator, it's about dynasty, survival, and the burdens that come with a famous name. Picture this: Washington, D.C., the early 1960s. Camelot is in full swing. The Kennedy name is golden. One brother is president, another is attorney general. And then there's Ted, just 30 years old, stepping into the Senate, carrying a legacy he didn't choose, but one he could never escape. But as the years unfolded, Senator Edward Ted Kennedy would become more than the youngest brother. He would become one of the most influential legislators in modern American history. Champion of healthcare, education, and civil rights. A master of the Senate floor, a deal maker, a lion of liberalism. And yet, his story is far from a clean arc of political success. It's complicated, messy, human. It includes a tragic car crash in Chappaquiddick that would stain his reputation forever, a failed presidential bid that exposed deep fractures in his image, and a lifetime of personal struggle behind the polished public face. Through it all, he remained a towering figure in American politics, loved by many, loathed by others, but never ignored. Today we peel back the layers of Ted Kennedy's life and legacy, from the high-stakes battles in Congress to the private demons that never fully went away. We'll explore the moments that defined him, and the moments that almost destroyed him. We'll hear from critics and colleagues, historians and family friends, because to understand Ted Kennedy is to understand not just one man, but the era he helped shape, and the mythos he both upheld and unraveled. So settle in, because today we explore the life, the scandal, the power, and the paradox of the last Kennedy brother. This is Senator Ted Kennedy, and you're listening to Inside American Politics with Bradley Teller. Let's start our journey in 1958, when a young Ted Kennedy made a decision that would change the trajectory of American politics forever. Picture this: Ted, still in law school, makes the bold choice to pause his studies and throw himself completely into his brother John F. Kennedy's senatorial re-election campaign. And folks, this wasn't just any campaign manager. Ted brought something special to the table. He had what political insiders called appealing Irish charm, striking good looks that made voters swoon, and most importantly, a natural ability to connect with Democratic voters across Massachusetts. Ted didn't just manage this campaign. He orchestrated a decisive victory that would set the stage for JFK's later successful bid for the presidency. Think about that for a moment. Without Ted's campaign genius in 1958, we might never have had President John F. Kennedy. The youngest Kennedy brother was already pulling the strings of American history before he was even 30 years old. But here's where the story gets really interesting. When JFK ascended to the presidency in 1960, his Senate seat suddenly became vacant. And Ted? Well, Ted felt a strong sense of entitlement to that position. After all, he'd practically handed his brother the presidency on a silver platter. There was just one tiny problem. The Constitution requires senators to be at least 30 years old, and Ted wasn't there yet. So what does a Kennedy do when the law stands in their way? They find a workaround, of course. During this waiting period, Ted engaged in legal practice as an assistant U.S. attorney in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, and this is classic Kennedy political maneuvering, an ally appointed by the governor conveniently held the Senate seat warm until a special election could take place. And when that special election finally happened, Ted won easily. Just like that, another Kennedy was in the Senate. But the universe, it seems, had other plans for the Kennedy family. Over the next 18 months, Ted Kennedy would experience two profound tragedies that would forever change not just his life, but the entire Kennedy dynasty. First came November 22, 1963, a date seared into American memory. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas didn't just rob the nation of its leader, it left Ted without his mentor, his political guide, and most importantly, his beloved brother Jack. But if you think tragedy was done with Ted Kennedy, you'd be dead wrong. In 1964, as if the assassination wasn't enough, Ted himself nearly died in an airplane crash. Picture this scene: the youngest Kennedy brother, already grieving his slain brother, now fighting for his own life in a hospital bed. The crash was so severe that when Ted finally returned to his Senate duties in January 1965, he needed a walking cane for support. Here's a moment that gives me chills every time I think about it. Ted Kennedy being sworn in alongside his brother Bobby Kennedy, who was now representing New York as a junior senator. Two brothers, both carrying the weight of Jack's legacy, both trying to fill shoes that seemed impossibly large. But within the Kennedy family hierarchy, and folks, hierarchy meant everything to these people, something crucial was happening. Bobby continually emphasized that he had inherited their slain brother's legacy, both within the family and politically. This wasn't just grief-talking. This was about power, succession, and who would carry the Kennedy torch forward. And Ted? Well, Ted was watching, learning, and waiting his turn. Now let me tell you something fascinating about the Kennedy family that most people don't understand. Titles weren't just formal addresses in this clan. They were reminders of status, power, and your place in the family pecking order. Helen Thomas, the legendary White House correspondent, once made an observation that perfectly captures this. She noted that titles almost served as reminders of one's status and role in life within the Kennedy household. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked. Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch, was frequently referred to as the ambassador, even in casual settings at home. Rose Kennedy wouldn't ask her children, "Have you seen your father?" Instead, she'd say, "Have you seen the ambassador?" Similarly, even after his death, JFK was often called the president. Rose would ask guests, "Will the president be joining us for dinner?" as if he might walk through the door at any moment. Bobby, upon becoming Attorney General, was typically referred to as the Attorney General. And Ted Kennedy? He was nearly always addressed as the Senator. Here's what really gets me about this. Throughout their entire marriage, Joan Kennedy often referred to her husband using his title even in social settings. She'd greet guests by saying, "The Senator and I are so happy to see you." And when Ted remarried, his second wife, Vicky, also frequently used the title when referring to him. This wasn't just formal politeness, folks. This was about power, respect, and maintaining the Kennedy mystique even in their own living rooms. But before Ted could fully embrace his role as the senator, the family had to deal with a potentially explosive scandal from his past. And let me tell you, the way they handled it was pure Kennedy political genius. The story goes back to 1951 when Ted was expelled from Harvard for cheating on a Spanish exam. Now, at the time, this didn't attract much attention. But fast forward to 1962, when Ted is finally eligible to run for Senate having turned 30 in February, and suddenly this old scandal is looking like a political time bomb. Ted was facing Eddie McCormick in the Democratic state primary, and this wasn't just any opponent. McCormick was the state attorney general and a close relative of John W. McCormick, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. This was going to be a real fight. So how do the Kennedys handle a potential scandal? They get ahead of it, that's how. President Kennedy personally selected Robert Healey of the Boston Globe to break the story. But here's the genius part. They controlled every aspect of how it was told. After intense discussions about placement and framing, they decided to use an interview-style headline. Ted Kennedy tells about Harvard examination incident. Notice how that sounds? Not Ted Kennedy caught cheating, or Kennedy expelled for academic fraud. No, this was Ted Kennedy telling about an incident. Masterful spin. And here's the kicker. They made sure the article didn't reveal the identity of the student who actually took the Spanish exam in Ted's place. Even in their damage control, they were protecting their network. But perhaps my favorite part of this whole story is President Kennedy's reaction to managing this crisis. As Robert Healey later recalled, JFK said, and I quote, "I'm having more fucking trouble with this Harvard cheating story than I did with the Bay of Pigs." Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States found his little brother's college cheating scandal more troublesome than a failed invasion of Cuba that nearly started World War III. That tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the Kennedys took Ted's political future. With the scandal successfully managed, Ted's campaign faced its next major hurdle, a debate with Eddie McCormick scheduled for August 27, 1962, at South Boston High School. And folks, this wasn't just any political debate. This was a verbal bloodbath that would define Ted Kennedy's early political identity. McCormick had been preparing for this moment. He'd been campaigning hard on his numerous achievements, constantly highlighting the contrast between his substantive record and Ted's only real credential, being the president's brother. When debate night arrived, McCormick went nuclear. He didn't just question Ted's qualifications, he dismissed his entire candidacy as a joke. McCormick stood on that stage and essentially told the voters that Ted Kennedy was nothing more than his famous last name, that his relevance came solely from being a Kennedy, not from any personal merit or achievement. It was brutal, direct, and absolutely devastating. Or at least it should have been. But here's what McCormick didn't understand about the Kennedy magic. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest political gift you can receive. Ted's response in the aftermath of this debate would prove that while he might have gotten his opportunity through his name, he had the political instincts to make the most of it. Now let me tell you about a side of Ted Kennedy that reveals the complexity of this man and his family dynamics. Throughout the Kennedy clan, Ted had a unique and special relationship with his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr. After Joe Sr. suffered his debilitating stroke, Ted became the only family member who could truly comprehend and interact with his father. While other family members struggled with Joe's condition, Ted's unwavering loyalty shone through. He would maintain 3-day vigils at his father's hospital bed, combining deep devotion with his characteristic mischievous sense of fun. Here's a story that perfectly captures Ted's personality and his comfort with his own body and sexuality. Rita Dallas, who had recently started working as a live-in caregiver for Joe, was asked by Rose Kennedy to bring a pile of towels to the sauna at Hyannisport. When she arrived, she was met with an unexpected sight. Teddy and his friends in their birthday suits, completely naked. But here's the thing that makes this story so quintessentially Ted Kennedy. Despite never having met Dallas before, he greeted her by name, cheerfully dancing around in the nude, and flamboyantly introduced her to his friends. Dallas was absolutely stunned. As she later recalled, this was her first and only encounter with a naked man. And there's Ted Kennedy, making introductions like he's hosting a cocktail party, instead of prancing around a sauna without a stitch of clothing. This story reveals something crucial about Ted's character: his complete lack of inhibition, his comfort with his own sexuality and body, and his to make any situation, no matter how potentially embarrassing, seem perfectly normal through sheer force of personality. Fast forward to 1991, and we encounter one of the most bizarre and troubling episodes in Ted Kennedy's later life. It had been 22 years since the Chappaquiddick incident, and Ted was now a divorced man, his marriage to Joan having ended in 1983. Picture this scene. Senator Ted Kennedy, his son Patrick, and nephew Willie Smith decide to have a guys' night out in Palm Beach. They head to Au Bar, a popular spot frequented by the newly wealthy and B-list celebrities like Ivana Trump and Roxanne Pulitzer. Ted orders his usual, a double Chivas Regal on the rocks. Patrick strikes up a conversation with Michelle Cassone, 27, while Willie meets Patricia Bowman, a 29-year-old single mom. Everything seems normal enough. Just 3 Kennedy men out for drinks and conversation. But then things take a turn. Willie tells Patricia about his upcoming medical career, and she shares concerns about her daughter's health issues. She finds Willie trustworthy and likable. The Kennedys join Patricia's friend Ann Mercer and her boyfriend Chuck Desiderio at their table. Here's where the night starts going sideways. Amid the loud music, Mercer starts a political argument with the senator. Ted, perhaps wisely, decides it's time to leave. Patrick invites Michelle Cassone to the Kennedy mansion for a drink and a view of the Atlantic, and she agrees, following them in her own car. Now, the Kennedy mansion at 1095 North Ocean Boulevard is no ordinary house. This is a Mediterranean-style mansion designed by Addison Misner in 1923, purchased by Joe Sr. during the Depression, for $120,000. This is where JFK wrote Profiles in Courage and his inaugural address. Known as La Guarida, it had been called the Kennedy Winter White House since JFK used it as a presidential retreat. But by the 1990s, first-time visitors often found its decor dated. Michelle Cassone later described it as dark, dingy, and smelly. Not exactly the glamorous Kennedy compound you might imagine. In the living room, Michelle, Ted, and Patrick chat and drink white wine. But here's where Michelle's account becomes particularly disturbing. She recalls that Ted was very drunk. Eventually, Ted leaves the room, and Patrick and Michelle move to a bedroom and start kissing. Then comes the moment that epitomizes everything wrong with Ted Kennedy's relationship with boundaries and appropriate behavior. Suddenly, Ted returns to the bedroom wearing only his underwear and a long-tailed shirt. Can you imagine? Here's a sitting U.S. senator wandering around drunk in his underwear while his son is with a woman. Michelle is understandably uncomfortable and decides to leave. Patrick escorts her to her car and bids her goodnight. But the story doesn't end there. Within 24 hours, a new Kennedy scandal would break, this time leading to a rape trial involving Willie Smith and Patricia Bowman. While Willie would eventually be acquitted, the incident would become yet another stain on the Kennedy legacy, and Ted's bizarre behavior that night would become part of the public record. Now here's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Ted Kennedy's personal life: his relationship with his youngest son, Patrick. While Ted played a vital substitute father figure for many of his nieces and nephews after their parents' deaths or personal struggles, when it came to his own son, he often found it difficult to show the same warmth and understanding. According to Thomas Franken, a childhood friend of Patrick's during their teenage years in Boston, Pat's father wasn't very patient with him. Franken remembered particularly harsh moments when Ted would criticize Patrick's athletic performance, drawing cruel comparisons to his older brother Teddy Jr., who, despite having only one leg due to childhood cancer, was said to play football better than Patrick. Picture this scene: a young Patrick struggling on the baseball field, and his father, instead of offering encouragement, jokingly likening him to a confused dog trying to catch a ball. The disappointment in Ted's voice was clear to everyone watching. Patrick later acknowledged his own challenges, saying, "I was born a fragile person." He suffered from chronic, severe asthma and described himself as socially awkward and often feeling alone. But here's the most heartbreaking part. The only times Patrick felt truly close to his father were during his worst asthma attacks, moments when his physical distress allowed him to receive the nurturing attention he desperately craved. In 1988, when Patrick was just 20 years old, he faced his own health crisis, undergoing surgery to remove a benign tumor from his spine. Though the ordeal was difficult, he eventually recovered and was declared cancer-free. That same year, he also sought treatment for cocaine addiction, a private battle that added another layer to the challenges of his young adulthood. But here's where Patrick's story takes an inspiring turn. According to Dunn Gifford, a close family associate, Patrick's choice to enter politics was largely motivated by his desperate desire to earn his father's respect and approval. In a bold move in 1988, while still just a sophomore in college, Patrick decided to run for a seat in the Rhode Island state legislature. He was challenging Jack Skeffington, a well-established incumbent who scoffed at Patrick's candidacy, sarcastically asking, "Who the hell is Patrick Kennedy?" Both Patrick and Ted found humor in the remark, and for the first time Ted seemed genuinely amused and proud of his son's fearless leap into the political arena. This was the moment their relationship began to change. Ted was genuinely thrilled by Patrick's decision to enter politics, especially since his other two children, Kara and Teddy Jr., had shown no interest in pursuing public office. Once Ted saw Patrick's passion for making a difference, he threw his full support behind him. "Pat thinks this world is worth fixing," Ted proudly said, finally recognizing his son's idealism and commitment. Patrick's campaign platform emphasized justice and compassion. He advocated for protecting the rights of senior citizens, standing up for legal immigrants, and defending the disadvantaged. His mother, Joan Kennedy, actively campaigned by his side and observed that Patrick's ideals mirrored those of his father in many ways. Unlike Ted, however, Patrick openly expressed his gratitude and affection toward his mother, something Joan deeply appreciated. Ted became heavily involved in Patrick's campaign efforts, assigning one of his top aides to assist and serving as an advisor himself, helping craft speeches and offering political guidance. Patrick personally contacted over 3,000 voters in the district, showing the same grassroots dedication that had made Ted successful decades earlier. The Kennedy family committed serious resources to this local campaign, spending an impressive $93,000, a substantial amount for a state legislative race at that time. But money was just the beginning of their commitment. On Election Day, the entire Kennedy clan mobilized in support. John F. Kennedy Jr., Joe Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy Jr., and several of their cousins from the Shriver family all joined the campaign trail to back Patrick in his political debut. This wasn't just about winning a local election. This was about Patrick finally earning his place in the Kennedy political dynasty, and Ted finally seeing his son as a worthy successor to the family legacy. Our final segment takes us to 1993, when Ted Kennedy faced a controversy that perfectly encapsulated the complex relationship between the Kennedy family's public Catholic faith and their private personal struggles. The scandal centered around Ted and his nephew, Congressman Joseph Kennedy II, son of the late Robert F. Kennedy. At the heart of the matter was their marital histories and how those histories conflicted with Roman Catholic Church doctrine. Joseph had married Sheila Brewster Rauch in February 1979. Sheila was vibrant and engaging, warmly welcomed by the Kennedy family. In 1980, they became parents to twin sons, Matthew Rauch Kennedy and Joseph Patrick Kennedy. But by the end of the decade, serious problems emerged. Sheila filed for divorce in 1990, finalized in 1991. In 1993, Joseph fell in love with Ann Elizabeth Beth Kelly, a former staffer who had accompanied him to Washington after his successful 1986 congressional run. Now, Joseph wanted to marry Beth in the Catholic Church, but there was a problem. The Catholic Church doesn't recognize divorce and considers first marriages valid and binding, unless officially annulled. This predicament echoed similar experiences within the family. Both Ted Kennedy and his sister Pat Kennedy Lawford had been divorced and were therefore barred from receiving Catholic sacraments, including Holy Communion and confession. Ted had a deep, enduring Catholic faith, instilled by his devout parents. His mother Rose often emphasized, "The most important element in human life is faith." Ted reiterated this belief during a 1983 speech at Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, where he spoke passionately about both his patriotism and religious beliefs. Yet Ted frequently found himself at odds with church teachings. Over time, he publicly supported abortion rights and later same-sex marriage, stances not aligned with Catholic doctrine. He privately believed some church positions were overly rigid and lacked compassion, though he continued respecting its authority and traditions. As both an influential senator and member of a prominent Catholic family, Ted quietly researched the church's annulment process. He discovered that annulments could be granted even after long-standing marriages, with around 60,000 granted annually. This discovery opened new possibilities for Joseph and revealed how the Kennedys, long guided by Catholic values, were grappling with modern realities and the challenges of adhering to strict church doctrines amid evolving personal and societal beliefs. And there you have it, the incredible, complex, and often contradictory story of Senator Ted Kennedy. From his early political maneuvering to secure a Senate seat, through personal scandals that would have destroyed lesser men, to his role as family patriarch struggling with his own demons and relationships. Ted Kennedy was a man who lived his entire life in the shadow of his martyred brothers, yet managed to create his own powerful legacy in the halls of the Senate. He was a father who could nurture his nieces and nephews while struggling to connect with his own son. He was a devout Catholic who repeatedly clashed with church doctrine. He was a man of privilege who genuinely fought for the disadvantaged. Perhaps most importantly, Ted Kennedy represents the complexity of American political dynasties, the way power, privilege, tragedy, and ambition can combine to create figures who are simultaneously inspiring and deeply flawed. The Kennedy name opened doors for Ted that would have remained closed to others, but it was his own political instincts, his ability to survive scandal after scandal, and his genuine legislative achievements that kept him in the Senate for nearly 5 decades. Love him or hate him, Ted Kennedy's story is quintessentially American, a tale of second chances, redemption, the price of privilege, and the enduring power of political legacy. That's our deep dive into the complex legacy of Senator Ted Kennedy, a man who, for better or worse, helped shape the modern American political landscape. From legislative triumphs to personal tragedies, from scandal to statesmanship, his story is one of contradiction, consequence, and undeniable influence. But this story isn't just about politics. It's about power and pressure, image and identity, and the weight of a family name that carried both promise and curse. Ted Kennedy lived in the long shadow of his brothers, yet forged a legacy that stood on its own, imperfect, but enduring. If you want to go deeper into Ted Kennedy's story, head over to the Skoob app. Because this isn't just history, it's a lens into the soul of American leadership and the price that often comes with it. Download Skoob on the App Store or Google Play to unlock the full experience. I'm Bradley Teller, and this has been Inside American Politics. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, behind every headline, there's always a deeper story.